Welcome to this channel, where we journey together through the mysteries of history, told in a slow, soothing rhythm, just enough for you to both explore knowledge and gently drift into sleep. Tonight we'll step into a day in the life of Alexander the Great, the young king who conquered nearly the entire ancient world. You'll hear not only the famous tales of battles and triumphs, but also the lesser-known details: how Alexander woke up each morning, what he ate on his campaigns, how he spoke with his companions and soldiers, and even how he endured those restless nights before battle. Each chapter will reveal a different piece of his daily life, sometimes glorious, sometimes exhausting, and at times shrouded in mystery, leading at last to his quiet end in Babylon. If you'd like to continue traveling with us through these gentle yet surprising journeys into history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss a single story. Now relax your body, listen closely, and let the past carry you away into a deep and peaceful sleep. Imagine this. You've just collapsed after marching nearly 20 miles, lugging a bronze shield that feels like carrying a cast-iron skillet the size of a manhole cover. The ground is cold, the night is damp, and you think, finally, I can sleep in. Nope, not in Alexander the Great's army. Sleeping late was never an option, because the young king liked to rise before dawn, mostly to remind everyone that he was different. Alexander, known to the Romans later as Megas Alexandros, Greek for Alexander the Great, which honestly sounds more like a brand slogan than a historical title, was obsessed with discipline. And discipline, of course, began with being dragged out of bed before the sun even bothered to show up. Before first light, guards would walk through camp, banging on shields or blasting a horn. That horn was called the salpinx, a long, straight Greek trumpet made of bronze. Its sound was piercing, sharper than your neighbor firing up a leaf blower at 6 a.m. The salpinx was the ancient world's version of a PA system. It signaled everything from form up to charge. In this case, it was just a very unpleasant alarm clock, with no snooze button. Groggy soldiers scrambled to lace up their caligae, military sandals with iron hobnails hammered into the soles. These weren't exactly Air Jordans. In fact, archaeologists who recreated them described the experience as like walking on thumbtacks after a few miles. And remember, Alexander's troops marched from Macedonia all the way through Asia Minor, the Middle East, Persia, and even into India. Ultramarathons in spiked sandals. Sound fun? Meanwhile, Alexander had a more relaxed routine. He didn't tie his own shoes, he had attendants for that, but he did get up early to exercise. Ancient sources, especially the Roman historian Plutarch, who lived nearly 400 years after Alexander, claim he started mornings with physical training, running, sword practice, and sometimes hunting. It was a clever way to send a message. I'm a king, but I'm also one of you. Fun fact: Alexander wasn't tall, about 5'4" or 5'5", average for a Greek of his time, but he made up for it with stamina and agility. And what about breakfast? If you're picturing pancakes, bacon, or even oatmeal, prepare to be disappointed. Soldiers ate barley bread, hard, dry, and baked on hot stones, sometimes with a chunk of cheese or salted olives. Archaeologists who've tried to replicate it say it tastes like a chewable brick. But that brick was fuel, and you either ate it or faced a long march on an empty stomach. Alexander himself probably didn't indulge much in the morning. Greek custom frowned on drinking unmixed wine. It was considered barbaric, literally what uncivilized foreigners did. So instead of a strong drink, he'd sip watered-down wine or herbal infusions. Ironically, Alexander would later gain a reputation for heavy drinking, but in the mornings he liked to keep things civilized. While the rank and file gnawed on their rock-hard bread, Alexander listened to reports from his commanders. His inner circle, called the somatophylax, bodyguards, updated him on scouting, water sources, terrain, possible enemy movement. Imagine it as a CEO's morning briefing with his executive team, except instead of sales numbers and quarterly goals, they discussed deserts, rivers, and Persian armies. That was dawn in Alexander's camp. Soldiers stumbling awake to the blare of the salpinx, tying on sandals that hurt more than they helped, chewing on survival bread, while their young king stretched, trained, and plotted how to conquer the known world. And remember, it was still only sunrise. Once the sun had finally crawled above the horizon, the Macedonian camp shifted from groggy chaos to military order. Think of it like the world's most disciplined morning commute, except instead of coffee and traffic jams, there were spears, shields, and the constant risk of ambush. Alexander's soldiers belonged to a highly structured war machine known as the Macedonian phalanx. If you're not familiar with the term, a phalanx was a tight infantry formation where soldiers locked shields and aimed their spears forward like a human porcupine. Alexander's father, King Philip II, had revolutionized this system by making the spears absurdly long. Called sarissas, they stretched about 18 feet, 5.5 meters. That's longer than a modern SUV. Imagine trying to march in a crowd while holding a telephone pole. You start to get the picture. So every morning, before the army could even start moving, soldiers had to check their gear. The sarissa was so long it was actually made in 2 pieces that could be screwed together. That way, it was possible to carry it on the march without knocking everyone's helmet off. Still, packing it up was like disassembling IKEA furniture, except with no manual and under the threat of being stabbed. The rest of their kit was no picnic either. Each soldier carried a round bronze shield, a sword, a helmet, armor, cooking equipment, and several days' worth of rations. Historians estimate a fully loaded Macedonian infantryman hauled 70 to 80 pounds of gear. In other words, they were basically ancient world backpackers, just with fewer scenic photos and more chances of dying in Persia. Meanwhile, Alexander wasn't just focused on logistics. He had a flair for ritual. Before every major march or battle, he often performed sacrifices to the gods. He'd slaughter an animal, usually a bull, goat, or sheep, burn parts of it, and interpret the smoke as a divine sign. To modern ears, it sounds a bit like astrology with extra barbecue, but in Alexander's world, it was deadly serious. Soldiers wanted to believe the gods were on their side. Nothing motivated an army like the idea that Zeus himself had RSVP'd to their campaign. And of course, there was Alexander's personal touch. Sources suggest he'd appear in front of his troops dressed in striking armor, sometimes even imitating the hero Achilles from Homer's Iliad. Why Achilles? Because Alexander was obsessed with him. As a boy, he kept a copy of the Iliad annotated by his tutor, Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle. By modeling himself after Achilles, Alexander sent a clear message. I'm not just a king, I'm a living legend. Imagine your boss showing up to the office wearing a Captain America costume, and somehow everyone finds it inspiring instead of weird. Finally, when the sacrifices were done and the troops assembled, the army began to move. Picture the scene. Tens of thousands of men marching in long columns, cavalry horses snorting, supply wagons creaking, the salpinx blaring to keep the rhythm. Dust rose in choking clouds. The heat was relentless, and yet the army advanced like a single, living organism. For the soldiers, it was grueling. For Alexander, it was exhilarating. Each step carried him closer to another conquest, another city to rename after himself. He founded at least 20 Alexandrias. Talk about an ego. And though the men might have grumbled about sore feet and dry bread, they couldn't deny it. They were following a commander who made the impossible feel inevitable. That was the daily transition, from sleepy camp to unstoppable war machine, repeated over and over again as Alexander marched his way across the ancient world. Once the camp dissolved into marching columns, The reality of life in Alexander's army hit hard. Forget the cinematic image of bronze-clad warriors striding heroically into the sunrise. In truth, most soldiers trudged forward like overworked delivery drivers, except their packages were 18-foot spears, iron weapons, and enough personal gear to snap a donkey's back. The pace was brutal. Alexander was known for pushing his men farther and faster than most armies of the ancient world. On good days, the phalanx could cover about 15-20 miles. On forced marches, sometimes even more. And remember, this wasn't strolling on paved Roman roads, which didn't even exist yet in the East. This was rocky terrain, dusty plains, and deserts where your sandals filled with grit until your feet looked like raw meat. To keep order, Alexander's officers used the salpinx trumpet again, blasting signals to maintain rhythm. Think of it as the ancient version of a marching playlist, except instead of upbeat tunes, you got a deafening metallic screech echoing across the ranks. Soldiers also had to stay in step, which meant walking shoulder to shoulder with no room for personal space. Imagine thousands of sweaty men shuffling in sync, like a giant, smelly conga line of death. The baggage train followed behind. Pack animals loaded with supplies, servants, engineers, siege equipment, and, of course, camp followers. Every army had them: traders, wives, prostitutes, cooks, even entertainers. Some historians joke that Alexander's mobile city moved across Asia like a traveling circus, with soldiers doing the heavy lifting and everyone else trying not to get trampled. And water? That was the obsession of every march. Alexander's scouts had to locate rivers, springs, or wells in advance, because without water, the phalanx collapsed faster than you can say, hydration. Ancient writers loved to tell dramatic stories of men nearly dying of thirst, only to be saved when Alexander himself refused water so he wouldn't drink what his soldiers couldn't. Whether or not that happened exactly as written, it's the kind of PR stunt every great leader needs: equal parts noble sacrifice and excellent marketing. Food wasn't much better. Rations consisted of barley bread, dried meat, cheese, and olives. Soldiers often had to grind their own grain using portable hand mills carried in the baggage train. Imagine ending a 20-mile march, then being told, "Congratulations, now bake your own dinner." It makes military MREs look like a Michelin star meal. And yet, the army kept moving. What drove them? Partly fear. Disobeying orders wasn't really an option, but also the intoxicating charisma of Alexander himself. He didn't just sit in a gilded chariot. He often marched alongside his men, ate the same bread, endured the same dust. Plutarch records that Alexander could cover ground faster than anyone, sometimes walking on foot to prove his stamina. That blend of cruelty and camaraderie kept morale just high enough to drag the phalanx one more mile, one more day, one more conquest. So the daily march was a grind: endless dust, aching feet, choking thirst, and the weight of empire on your back. But with every step, the army advanced deeper into lands no Greek had ever seen. For the soldiers, it was misery. For Alexander, it was destiny. When Alexander's troops finally reached the day's destination, they didn't just collapse in the dirt and call it a night. No, this was the Macedonian army, a professional war machine, and even rest came wrapped in discipline. The first priority was always security. The ancient battlefield didn't pause just because the sun went down, and surprise night attacks were a constant threat. That's why the army established a fortified camp at the end of every march. Picture a pop-up city that could be built in just a few hours, complete with defenses, roads, and quarters for thousands of men. Engineers marked out the perimeter, often digging trenches or piling up earthen walls. Stakes and sharpened logs were driven into the ground for extra protection. This wasn't just paranoia. Alexander's enemies, from Persian cavalry to tribal raiders, loved to strike when soldiers were tired. A well-organized camp was the difference between a secure night and a massacre. Inside the camp, everything had its place. Soldiers pitched their leather tents in neat rows, forming streets that allowed officers to move quickly and keep order. Units camped together, reinforcing camaraderie and preventing desertion. The officers' tents and Alexander's own pavilion were positioned near the center, symbolizing control, like a general sitting at the heart of a chessboard. Once the defenses and tents were up, the second priority was food. Soldiers had to prepare their rations, grinding grain, baking flatbread, boiling whatever dried meat or beans they had. Archaeologists have found the portable stone mills they used, which were heavy enough to double as workout equipment. After marching 20 miles, the last thing you'd want to do is squat over a grindstone. But welcome to life in Alexander's army. Water had to be collected too, sometimes from nearby streams, sometimes carried in by pack animals. The army couldn't survive without strict rationing, and officers monitored distribution closely. Ancient sources tell us Alexander himself occasionally shared hardships, refusing extra food or water if his men couldn't have it. Whether this was genuine or staged leadership theater, it worked. Soldiers believed their king suffered alongside them. But camp life wasn't all toil and misery. Once the chores were done, there was downtime. Soldiers repaired equipment, swapped stories, or gambled with dice. Camp followers, merchants, entertainers, and yes, the inevitable sex workers, added to the bustle. The atmosphere could resemble a rough and ready festival, except the looming shadow of war hung over everything. And Alexander? His evenings were often busier than his mornings. He held councils with his generals, planning routes and strategy. He listened to scouts' reports, debated logistics, and sometimes dictated letters. According to Plutarch, he also enjoyed long discussions on philosophy, science, and literature. Proof that even in the dust of Asia, he carried the intellectual training Aristotle had drilled into him. Of course, he also drank. While mornings were sober, nights were notorious for feasting and heavy wine. Banquets could last for hours, filled with music, conversation, and occasionally brawls. As night fell, guards rotated shifts around the perimeter, posted with shields and spears. The army slept in a silence broken only by horses snorting, fires crackling, and the occasional burst of laughter from officers drinking a bit too much. To modern ears, it sounds exhausting. And it was. But this disciplined nightly ritual allowed Alexander's army to march across continents and keep functioning like a single relentless organism. So, after a day of brutal marching and relentless labor, the soldiers of Alexander's army finally lay down, wrapped in cloaks under their tents, aching and hungry but alive. Tomorrow the cycle would begin again. Dawn, the salpink's trumpet, the march, the grind. And for Alexander? He slept, knowing he was one step closer to carving his name across the map of the world. When darkness finally settled over the Macedonian camp, the army seemed to exhale. Fires flickered along the rows of tents, casting orange light against leather canvas and bronze helmets stacked neatly by the entrance. For a brief moment, the endless dust, noise, and discipline gave way to something more human. Fatigue. Soldiers lay down wrapped in woolen cloaks, using shields or bundles of clothing as makeshift pillows. Forget featherbeds. The ground was their mattress, hard and uneven. Some men drifted off immediately, their snores blending with the low hum of voices and the occasional whinny of horses. Others, especially the younger recruits, tossed and turned, struggling to sleep under the knowledge that tomorrow meant another punishing march. Or worse, battle. And yet, nobody truly slept soundly. Guards patrolled the perimeter in shifts, spears in hand, ears tuned for danger. Each unit rotated its watch, and if you were unlucky enough to draw the midnight shift, you could expect 2 cold, sleepless hours standing in silence, staring into the dark. Falling asleep on duty was punishable by death. not exactly the kind of job perk you'd brag about. Inside his pavilion, Alexander lived a very different kind of knight. By day, he played the role of tireless conqueror. By night, he revealed the restless energy of a man who could not stop moving, even in his mind. Ancient sources say he rarely slept long, often waking to plan, dictate orders, or call in his officers for yet another midnight council. Some nights he paced, poring over maps, dreaming of the next horizon to conquer. Other nights he feasted and drank deep, surrounding himself with companions in a haze of wine, music, and arguments that could turn heated. Plutarch even describes Alexander as possessed by sleepless ambition, a man who viewed rest as a kind of weakness. And indeed, how could he sleep easily? He carried the weight of empire on his shoulders, and every day pushed deeper into lands no Greek had ever seen. For him, the campfire shadows were not just the end of a day. They were the threshold of destiny. Meanwhile, ordinary soldiers faced their own night terrors. Some prayed quietly to the gods, whispering to Athena or Ares for protection. Others muttered curses about blisters, hunger, or the sheer madness of following a 20-something king across half the known world. But even their complaints had limits. After all, grumbling too loudly in Alexander's army was a quick way to earn a flogging. So the camp drifted into uneasy silence. Fires dimmed, guards changed posts, and the army slept, lightly, restlessly, but enough to rise again when the Salpink's trumpet blared at dawn. And Alexander? He lay awake longer than most, staring into the darkness of his tent, already thinking of the next day's march, the next battle, the next city that would bear his name. For his men, the night was a pause. For Alexander, it was only an intermission in his relentless pursuit of glory. If the rank-and-file soldiers were the backbone of Alexander's army, then his companions, both military and personal, were the brain and the heart. These men weren't just officers. They were the ones who lived closest to Alexander, shared his food, fought by his side, and sometimes argued with him late into the night. The Greeks had a word for them, heteroi, meaning companions or close associates. The cavalry unit by that name, the companion cavalry, was the elite strike force of Alexander's army, but the term also carried a personal weight. These were not faceless subordinates. They were his friends, drinking partners, and occasionally rivals. Take Hephaestion, for example, Alexander's closest companion, often described by ancient writers as his other self. If Alexander was Achilles, Hephaestion was his Patroclus. Hephaestion wasn't just a general. He was confidant, advisor, and maybe more, depending on how you read the ancient sources. To the soldiers, their bond symbolized loyalty. To modern historians, it raises questions about how personal affection and political ambition blended in Alexander's camp. Then there was Ptolemy, who would later carve out Egypt for himself and found a dynasty that lasted 3 centuries. At the time, though, he was one of Alexander's trusted bodyguards, a somatophylax, literally a protector of the body. Think of him as part Secret Service, part drinking buddy, part aspiring CEO in the world's bloodiest startup. We can't forget Parmenion, the seasoned General Alexander inherited from his father, Philip II. If Alexander was the fiery young prodigy, Parmenion was the cautious veteran. Their relationship was complicated, respect on one hand, tension on the other. Alexander often wanted bold gambles, while Parmenion urged caution. "If I were Alexander, I would take it slower," he once advised. Alexander supposedly shot back. "If I were Parmenion, I would too." It was the ancient world equivalent of, "Okay, boomer." Evenings in camp often revealed the dynamics of this inner circle. After the soldiers ate their barley bread and collapsed, Alexander's tent became the stage for strategy sessions, or drinking contests. Greeks had a peculiar relationship with wine. They always mixed it with water. Drinking it unmixed, as mentioned earlier, was considered barbaric. But Alexander was notorious for overindulging anyway, and his companions went along with it. Banquets stretched into the night, filled with debates on philosophy, arguments about tactics, and sometimes brawls fueled by too much wine and too little patience. But these weren't just social events. They were also the breeding ground for decisions that shaped history. A late-night conversation in Alexander's tent could determine whether the army would march toward Egypt, Persia, or India. His companions weren't just there to nod along. They argued, persuaded, and sometimes openly defied him. Their loyalty was deep, but it wasn't blind. And Alexander, though a king, thrived on that clash of voices, at least until someone pushed him too far. In this way, Alexander's daily routine wasn't just about marches and battles. It was also about managing relationships, balancing affection and authority, trust and suspicion, brilliance and ego. His companions kept him grounded, but they also fed his ambition. Without them, Alexander might never have conquered so much. With them, he became unstoppable, at least for a while. If the Macedonian phalanx was the shield of Alexander's army, the companion cavalry was the hammer. These weren't just horsemen. They were the sharp, deadly edge of his campaigns, the unit that could smash through enemy lines like a battering ram on 4 legs. The term in Greek was hetairoi, the same word used for Alexander's inner circle of friends. That wasn't an accident. The cavalry was not only elite in skill, but elite in status. Its members were drawn from Macedonian nobility, the sons of wealthy families who could afford horses and armor. To ride in the companion cavalry was to sit at the king's table, both literally and figuratively. Their equipment was designed for shock and awe. The key weapon was the ziston, a long cavalry spear about 12-14 feet, 3.54 meters in length. Unlike the infantry's unwieldy sarissa, the ziston was manageable on horseback, but still long enough to skewer enemy soldiers before they could reach the rider. If the spear broke, the cavalryman drew his kopis, a heavy, curved sword designed for slashing. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a machete, but made for splitting helmets instead of jungle vines. Their armor varied. Wealthier riders wore bronze breastplates, helmets with horsehair crests, and greaves to protect their legs. Others wore lighter linen cuirasses for mobility. But the true power wasn't in the gear. It was in the formation. The companion cavalry fought in a wedge formation, a triangle with Alexander himself often riding at the tip. This allowed them to punch through enemy lines at a single point, concentrating their momentum like a spear thrust. Once the wedge broke through, the rest of the army followed. If the phalanx pinned the enemy in place, the companions shattered them. Training was relentless. Horses had to be drilled to respond instantly to commands, to charge in tight formation without panicking. Riders practiced not only combat but coordination, learning to wheel and turn as one. Imagine the Blue Angels Air Squadron, but with horses, spears, and a much higher chance of someone being gored. And then there was the bond between rider and horse. Alexander himself gave the ultimate example with Bucephalus, his legendary stallion. According to legend, Bucephalus was untamable until young Alexander figured out the trick. The horse was afraid of its own shadow, so he turned its head toward the sun. That story may sound like a parable, but it illustrates how much horses mattered. To lose your horse in battle was more than inconvenience. It was humiliation, even disaster. On campaign, the companions weren't just shock troops. They were also Alexander's mobile strike force, able to scout ahead, raid supply lines, and chase down fleeing enemies. Their reputation grew so fearsome that often, just the sight of them assembling was enough to rattle opposing armies. Persian infantry, who had never seen such disciplined cavalry, were often crushed before they realized what hit them. But make no mistake, this wasn't a comfortable posting. Riding for hours in the blazing sun, armor heating like a frying pan, thighs rubbed raw against leather saddles, being in the companion cavalry took stamina as much as status. Yet the glory was undeniable. To charge alongside Alexander himself, to break enemies in the thunder of hooves and steel, it was the closest thing to immortality a young Macedonian noble could hope for. So, every day, as the phalanx trudged forward with shields and bread, the companions rode beside them, the king's hammer waiting to strike. And when Alexander pointed forward, they knew exactly what to do. Lower the Ziston, tighten the wedge, and ride straight into history. If the companion cavalry was Alexander's hammer, then the Macedonian phalanx was the anvil. Together they created a deadly trap. The infantry held the enemy in place, and the cavalry smashed them apart. Simple in theory, brutal in practice. The phalanx wasn't Alexander's invention. Credit goes to his father, Philip II of Macedon, who had the genius to take the old Greek hoplite model and supercharge it. Instead of the standard 8-foot spear, Philip armed his infantry with the monstrous sarissa, a pike nearly 18-20 feet long, 5.5 to 6 meters. To put that in perspective, it's longer than a modern city bus door to door. Soldiers held the sarissa with both hands, meaning they couldn't carry the heavy hoplite shield. Instead, they strapped a smaller shield to their left arm for partial protection. Now picture this: rows upon rows of men, each holding out a spear so long that the first 5 ranks could project their points beyond the front line. From the enemy's perspective, it looked like charging into a forest of steel. Horses refused to ride into it, and infantry who tried often ended up skewered before they could swing a sword. But the real secret wasn't just the weapon, it was the discipline. A phalanx only worked if everyone stayed perfectly in line, shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears angled together. Lose formation, and the whole wall collapsed like a row of dominoes. That's why Philip, and later Alexander, drilled their men relentlessly. The Macedonian phalanx wasn't just a bunch of tough guys. It was a machine, one that marched, turned, and struck as a single body. Of course, this machine came with problems. Marching with a sarissa was awkward. Imagine hauling a telephone pole on your shoulder for miles. Battles were worse. Soldiers were packed in so tightly they could barely move, pressed together in a sweaty, armored sardine can. If someone in the front panicked, the men behind shoved him forward anyway. Ancient writers note that phalanx battles often devolved into grueling shoving contests, with each side trying to push the other off balance while stabbing furiously in the gaps. It was as glamorous as trying to win a bar fight inside an elevator. And yet, under Alexander, the phalanx became legendary. At the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, for example, tens of thousands of Persian troops, cavalry, infantry, even war elephants, couldn't break the phalanx. It advanced steadily, spears bristling, while Alexander used his cavalry to deliver the knockout blow. The Persians, with all their numbers and wealth, melted away before this wall of discipline. But let's be clear, for the average Macedonian infantryman, life in the phalanx wasn't glorious. It was sweaty, claustrophobic, and terrifying. You had to trust the men beside you not to falter, and you had to keep your place no matter how much fear clawed at your gut. One slip, one broken line, and the entire formation could collapse. In other words, teamwork or death. Still, the phalanx gave Alexander exactly what he needed: a reliable core, a human wall that could hold the enemy in place long enough for him to unleash his favorite trick: the companion cavalry charge. Alone, the phalanx was strong but limited. Combined with Alexander's brilliance, it became unstoppable. So every morning, after the salpink's trumpet blasted them awake, these men shouldered their sarissas, tightened formation, and prepared to become a moving fortress. And when the dust cleared at day's end, more often than not, they were still standing. Proof that discipline, however miserable, was the true engine of empire. While the companion cavalry and the phalanx stole most of the glory, Alexander's army wasn't just spears and horses. Hidden behind the shining armor and dramatic charges were the unsung specialists, the men whose skills made the difference between victory and disaster. They weren't glamorous, but they were essential. First, the archers. Unlike the longbowmen of later medieval fame, Macedonian archers often carried short composite bows made from wood, horn, and sinew. These bows were smaller but packed serious punch, perfect for quick volleys. They didn't stand toe-to-toe with enemies. They softened them up, harassed cavalry, and kept foes at a distance while the heavy infantry moved in. Many of Alexander's archers weren't even Macedonian. He recruited skilled bowmen from Crete, Thrace, and other regions, outsourcing ancient style. Then came the slingers. If that word makes you think of children throwing rocks, think again. A professional slinger could hurl a lead bullet the size of a walnut over 400 yards, farther than most bows could shoot. These projectiles hit with the force of a modern handgun. Roman writers later described skulls split open and armor dented by sling stones. Cheap to equip, deadly in practice, slingers were the ancient world's snipers, and they terrified anyone unlucky enough to be in range. But perhaps the most fascinating specialists were the engineers. Alexander wasn't just a battlefield commander, he was a master of sieges. His engineers built towers, battering rams, and catapults capable of hurling stones the size of beach balls. At the famous Siege of Tyre, 332 BCE, Alexander's engineers constructed an enormous causeway out into the sea to reach the island city, basically terraforming their way to victory. Imagine thousands of men hauling stones into the surf under enemy fire until an artificial bridge stretched half a mile. That wasn't just persistence, it was madness combined with engineering genius. Alongside them were the sappers, men who dug tunnels under enemy walls to collapse them. Digging in the dark, praying the roof didn't cave in on your head, while defenders above poured boiling water or flaming oil into your shaft. This was the worst job in the army. And yet, Alexander's sappers performed miracles. At Gaza, they burrowed under the city walls, weakening the foundations until the defenses toppled. Not glorious, but brutally effective. Let's not forget the scouts and light infantry. Thracian and Illyrian javelin throwers, agile and fast, darted around the battlefield to harass enemies and guard the flanks. They didn't wear much armor. Speed was their shield. Think of them as the army's mosquitoes, annoying, relentless, and surprisingly deadly in swarms. All of these specialists gave Alexander what no other general of his age had: flexibility. His army wasn't just a single weapon, it was a toolbox. Heavy infantry for the grind, cavalry for the strike, archers and slingers for range, engineers for sieges. Alexander knew how to combine them, adapting to terrain and enemy tactics. That's why he could beat Persian cavalry on open plains, storm island fortresses, and even face war elephants in India. Of course, for the soldiers themselves, being a specialist wasn't glamorous. Slingers were often seen as second class compared to real warriors. Engineers worked like exhausted construction crews, and sappers risked suffocating underground. But in Alexander's campaigns, they were indispensable. The king understood something many commanders forgot. Wars aren't won by glory alone. They're won by the dirty, technical, unglamorous work that makes the glory possible. So while history remembers the cavalry charges and the wall of spears, the reality is this: without the men who slung stones, dug tunnels, and hammered wood into siege towers, Alexander might have been just another ambitious king who dreamed too big. Instead, he became Alexander the Great. If you imagine Alexander's army as a giant orchestra, Then the phalanx was the steady drumbeat, the companion cavalry the thunderous brass, and the specialists, archers, slingers, engineers, the subtle strings and woodwinds weaving complexity into the sound. Alone, each part was impressive. But together, under Alexander's direction, they created a symphony of war that no ancient enemy could match. At the heart of it was coordination. Unlike many commanders of his era who just threw troops forward in a chaotic brawl, Alexander choreographed battles like a stage director. The phalanx advanced slowly, shields locked, sarissas angled forward, creating a wall of steel that fixed the enemy in place. They didn't have to win outright. They just had to hold. And they held with terrifying discipline. Meanwhile, the archers and slingers provided the opening music, volleys of arrows and stones, harassing cavalry and softening enemy lines. Enemies who tried to outflank the phalanx found themselves pelted from a distance. It wasn't glamorous, but it drained morale and bought time. Then came the decisive movement. Alexander himself, at the head of the companion cavalry wedge. At precisely the right moment, often when the enemy was stretched thin or distracted, Alexander drove his cavalry straight into a weak point. Imagine a 12-foot spear lowered, hundreds of horses pounding the earth, and the king himself at the tip of the formation. The enemy line cracked, and once it cracked, it broke. This combination was so effective that it became Alexander's signature move. At Gaugamela, 331 BCE, against the vastly larger Persian army of Darius III, he used it to perfection. The phalanx advanced methodically, absorbing wave after wave of attacks, while light troops kept Persian cavalry at bay. Then Alexander spotted the opening, a gap in the enemy line, and charged. The companion cavalry smashed through, aiming straight for Darius. The Persian king fled, and with him, the battle. But it wasn't always about open plains. Alexander also proved a master of sieges. There, his engineers and sappers took center stage, turning what could have been drawn-out stalemates into brutal displays of ingenuity. At Tyre, his floating bridge and siege towers turned an island fortress into rubble. At Gaza, his tunneling sappers collapsed walls that seemed impregnable. The army wasn't just a blunt weapon, it was a Swiss army knife with a blade for every occasion. Of course, this kind of coordination required something rare in the ancient world: trust. Every soldier had to believe that the man beside him would hold the line, that the cavalry would charge at the right moment, that the engineers would get the towers up in time. And above all, they had to trust Alexander. Trust that their endless marches, their thirst, their blistered feet, all led to victories no one else could have delivered. In modern terms, Alexander wasn't just a battlefield commander, he was a systems thinker. He saw his army not as a collection of units, but as an integrated organism. He knew how to use each piece in harmony, when to press, when to wait, and when to gamble everything on a single decisive strike. That's why he never lost a major battle. That's why his enemies, whether Persian kings or Indian warlords, found themselves broken by a force that seemed less like an army and more like fate itself rolling forward. For the soldiers, of course, it felt less like fate and more like exhaustion. Each battle left bodies, sweat, and blood in the dust. But in the legend that grew around Alexander, their suffering was transformed into glory. And glory, for Macedonians at least, was worth every mile, every march, every bruise and scar. Thus, by blending discipline with daring, brute force with precision, Alexander turned his army into the deadliest instrument of conquest the ancient world had ever seen. A true symphony of war, with him as its conductor. It's easy to imagine Alexander the Great as a marble statue, perfect armor, heroic posture, gazing nobly into the distance. But the real Alexander was far more complicated. a bundle of energy, obsession, and quirks that made him both inspiring and infuriating to everyone around him. First, let's talk about his appearance. Alexander wasn't the towering giant some might picture. Ancient sources suggest he was around 5'4" or 5'5", average for his time, with a sturdy but lean build. He had light skin, piercing eyes, some said one was slightly different in color, and famously, a head of hair that refused to lie flat. Statues show his hair swept upward like a lion's mane, which became part of his signature image. Modern historians sometimes joke that if hair gel had existed in 330 BCE, Alexander would have cornered the market, but Alexander's personality outshone his looks. Plutarch describes him as philotimos. Ambitious doesn't quite cover it. It's more like pathologically obsessed with glory. He grew up with Aristotle as his tutor, reading Homer's Iliad as a sacred text. He supposedly slept with a copy of it under his pillow, annotated by Aristotle himself. To Alexander, life was about one thing: living like Achilles, the ultimate warrior hero. Ordinary kings settled for ruling their kingdoms. Alexander wanted to etch his name across the world map. This obsession showed in his daily habits. He was famous for his restlessness. Unlike many kings, who slept late and enjoyed long banquets, Alexander often rose early, exercised, and constantly looked for the next challenge. Even at night, he rarely slept long. Officers complained that he called strategy meetings at absurd hours, pacing like a caged lion. If ambition were caffeine, Alexander was permanently overdosed. But ambition had its dark side. He was known for his temper. Usually charismatic and composed, he could suddenly erupt in bursts of rage. The most infamous case was the killing of Cletus the Black, one of his veteran officers. Drunk at a banquet, Cletus insulted Alexander, reminding him that his victories owed much to his father, Philip. Enraged, Alexander grabbed a spear and killed him on the spot. Moments later, he was overcome with grief, locking himself away for days. It was a glimpse of the fragile ego behind the conqueror's mask. And then there was Alexander's drinking. The Greeks considered it civilized to dilute wine with water, but Alexander often ignored that rule. Banquets in his camp could last all night, filled with debates, music, and, inevitably, arguments fueled by too much wine. His drinking marathons became legendary, and though they may have bonded him with his companions, they also led to reckless decisions, and more than one regrettable outburst. Yet, despite his flaws, Alexander had an extraordinary ability to connect with his soldiers. He marched on foot beside them, endured hunger and thirst, and sometimes refused water so he wouldn't have more than his men. Whether staged or sincere, these gestures mattered. Soldiers felt he shared their hardships. To them, Alexander wasn't just a distant king. He was a leader in the mud, sweating and bleeding with them. All of this made him deeply human, brilliant and inspiring, but also insecure, volatile, and driven by an obsession that no conquest could satisfy. He was a man who dreamed of outdoing Achilles, but who sometimes couldn't even control his own temper at dinner. A man who conquered empires, yet lay awake at night restless, chasing visions of worlds that didn't even exist. That, perhaps, was the secret of his greatness and his tragedy. Alexander wasn't content to be a king. He wanted to be a myth. And in chasing that myth, he reshaped the ancient world. So what did the most ambitious man in the ancient world actually do all day, when he wasn't charging into battle or plotting the downfall of empires? The answer: a strange mix of ordinary routine, royal showmanship, and restless energy that never quite let him sit still. Let's start with food. Alexander was famously frugal with meals, at least compared to the banquets he threw at night. During the day, he ate simply: bread, dried meat, fruit, and sometimes a little wine, diluted with water. Writers like Plutarch insist he avoided heavy feasts while campaigning, not because he was health-conscious in a modern sense, but because he wanted to project the image of discipline. Soldiers noticed. When their king ate the same rough bread and olives as they did, it made complaints about rations harder to justify. But food wasn't just nutrition, it was propaganda. At big feasts, Alexander displayed his generosity by giving away lavish portions to companions and officers. Think of it as the ancient version of a leader buying everyone dinner, except instead of pizza, it was roasted oxen, wine, and the occasional exotic delicacy looted from Persia. Next, clothing and image. Alexander wasn't extravagant in his personal dress, at least not at first. Early in his campaigns, he wore traditional Macedonian gear, a simple tunic, a cloak called a chlamys, and sturdy boots. But as his empire expanded, his wardrobe changed. He began adopting elements of Persian dress, flowing robes, jeweled belts, even the royal diadem. To the Greeks, this was scandalous, proof he was going native. To Alexander, it was smart politics. By blending Greek and Persian fashion, he presented himself as a universal king, not just a Macedonian conqueror. In other words, image management 101. And then there was travel. Alexander didn't ride in a chariot like some pompous kings. He rode horseback, often on Bucephalus, his legendary stallion. He wanted to be seen by his troops, moving with them, not aloof. His pace was relentless. Historians note that he often outmarched his men, covering huge distances with alarming speed. For soldiers trudging behind, it was inspiring and exhausting. One quipped story has it that the only thing harder than fighting Alexander's battles was keeping up with his walking speed. When he wasn't riding or marching, Alexander spent hours in council meetings. He listened to scouts, debated with generals, and planned routes. Unlike some rulers who delegated, Alexander micromanaged almost everything, from battlefield formations to supply lines. His intensity left little room for relaxation, and his officers often found themselves dragged into late-night strategy sessions when they'd rather be asleep. But perhaps the most revealing detail of his daily routine was his inability to rest. Ancient sources say he slept very little, and even then, he often woke in the middle of the night to read, plan, or pace. He kept scrolls of Homer's Iliad close by, and supposedly carried Aristotle's annotated copy everywhere. Imagine a modern general carrying around a dog-eared copy of The Art of War and quoting it at breakfast. That was Alexander. In short, his daily life on campaign balanced the ordinary and the extraordinary. On one hand, he ate the same rough bread as his men, dressed simply, and rode horseback for miles in the dust. On the other, he projected royal charisma at feasts, wore Persian robes to send political messages, and never stopped scheming about new conquests. For his soldiers, this routine was a constant reminder. Their king wasn't just another ruler who sat on a throne. He was a restless force of nature, always planning, always moving, always pushing them and himself toward the next horizon. And that restlessness, more than any spear or horse, was Alexander's true weapon. Alexander wasn't just a conqueror with a sharp sword and an ego to match. He also fancied himself a philosopher king. And to be fair, he had the resume for it. After all, his childhood tutor was none other than Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle, the student of Plato, the man whose writings shaped Western thought for centuries. Under Aristotle, young Alexander studied everything from logic and ethics to medicine, zoology, and literature. But the crown jewel was Homer's Iliad, which Alexander treated less like poetry and more like a personal instruction manual. He idolized Achilles, the wrathful hero, and styled himself as a modern-day version. The Iliad wasn't just bedtime reading, it was his script for how to live, fight, and die gloriously. Imagine a modern general carrying around the Lord of the Rings and genuinely believing he is Aragorn. This philosophical foundation gave Alexander a curious double identity. On one hand, he absorbed Aristotle's Greek ideals of rationality, virtue, and civic order. On the other, he was utterly consumed by the Homeric obsession with eternal glory. Kleos, the undying fame of being remembered forever. Ordinary men worried about survival. Alexander worried about whether future generations would still be saying his name. Spoiler: they did. As his empire expanded, Alexander faced a new challenge: how to govern a patchwork of cultures that stretched from Greece to Egypt to Persia to India. His solution? Fusion. He began blending Greek and Persian traditions in ways that scandalized his Macedonian officers. He wore Persian robes, adopted Persian court rituals, and even demanded practices like proskynesis, bowing or prostrating before the king. To Persians, this was normal respect. To Greeks and Macedonians, it looked dangerously close to worship. His men grumbled, "We follow a king, not a god." But Alexander wasn't doing this just for vanity. Well, not only. He genuinely believed he was creating something new. A cosmopolitan empire where Greeks and Persians could share rule. He encouraged intermarriage between his officers and Persian noblewomen, famously staging a mass wedding at Susa, where thousands of soldiers married en masse. He himself took Persian wives, including Roxana of Bactria, blending bloodlines as well as cultures. Still, the project was messy. Macedonians resisted. Persians resented. Alexander's dream of fusion often looked more like forced assimilation, but it showed his restless intellect. He didn't just want to conquer. He wanted to redesign the world order. At night, in his tent, surrounded by maps and scrolls, Alexander sometimes debated philosophy with his companions. Imagine the scene: wine cups scattered, generals arguing about logistics, and Alexander suddenly quoting Aristotle on virtue or Plato on the soul. It probably annoyed his war-weary officers, but it reveals a truth about him. He wasn't satisfied being just a warlord. He wanted to be seen as a thinker, a statesman, almost a prophet of a new age. Of course, there's irony here. For all his talk of blending cultures and following Aristotle's teachings, Alexander's empire collapsed almost instantly after his death. His generals carved it up like vultures at a feast. The cosmopolitan dream gave way to brutal power politics. Still, the legend endured. The philosopher king who conquered the world with one hand and tried to unite it with the other. That tension, between the rational lessons of Aristotle and the fiery ambitions of Achilles, defined Alexander's daily life. By day, he led men into war. By night, he imagined himself reshaping civilization. And somewhere between those two extremes lay the restless, brilliant, flawed human being we still remember. For all his brilliance, Alexander carried within him a storm. The same ambition that drove him to conquer the known world also fed a dangerous mix of paranoia, insecurity, and volcanic temper. If earlier we saw him as the noble philosopher king, here we see the other side. Alexander the unpredictable, Alexander the terrifying. The most infamous story is the death of Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's most trusted officers. Clytus had saved Alexander's life years earlier at the Battle of Granicus. You'd think that kind of loyalty earned a lifetime of gratitude. Instead, during a drunken banquet in 328 BCE, words spiraled into insults. Clytus mocked Alexander, accusing him of forgetting his father Philip and becoming too Persian in his habits. The room froze. Alexander's temper exploded. In a fit of rage, he snatched a spear and drove it through Clytus on the spot. Moments later, sobriety and regret crashed down on him. Alexander reportedly wept, locked himself away, and refused food for days. But the damage was done. His men saw a king who could kill his friends as easily as he killed his enemies. The incident became a chilling reminder. Closeness to Alexander brought both honor and mortal risk. And Cleitus wasn't the only casualty of Alexander's darker moods. Suspicion gnawed at him constantly. The deeper into Asia he marched, the more he worried about plots, betrayal, or disloyalty among his officers. After the discovery of an alleged conspiracy involving Philotas, son of the old general Parmenio, Alexander ordered him executed. Worse, he had Parmenion himself killed as a precaution, the same Parmenion who had guided his campaigns since the beginning. This paranoia wasn't baseless. Great empires attract real plots, but Alexander's response was often excessive, blurring into cruelty. To his soldiers, he was both the leader who shared their hardships and the unpredictable tyrant who might turn on anyone. Imagine working for a boss who inspires you to greatness at 9 a.m., then throws a spear at you by dinner. His anger also spilled into grand displays of destruction. At the burning of Persepolis, after conquering the Persian capital, Alexander allowed, or perhaps ordered, the city's palaces to be set ablaze. Ancient sources disagree on whether it was drunken revenge for Persia's invasion of Greece or a calculated political move. Either way, the image of the civilizing conqueror went up in smoke, replaced by flames licking at centuries of Persian culture. Even his attempts at cultural fusion carried a dark edge. The demand for proskynesis, bowing before him, struck Macedonians as an insult, almost sacrilegious. To Alexander, it was a political gesture, but to his men, it felt like worship. When Callisthenes, the official court historian and a relative of Aristotle, publicly refused to bow, he soon found himself accused of conspiracy and executed. Philosophy was no shield against suspicion. These moments reveal a man haunted by the very greatness he chased. To maintain his image as a living legend, Alexander could not tolerate dissent. To secure his empire, he sometimes destroyed the trust that held it together. His companions admired him, but they also feared him. His soldiers loved him, but they whispered about his temper. In the end, Alexander's darker side wasn't separate from his greatness. It was part of the same relentless drive. The ambition that inspired his men also consumed him. The desire for glory that led him to conquer Persia also led him to kill Cleitus. He was, in short, human, a man whose flaws burned as brightly as his genius. And as the army marched ever farther east, into harsher lands and stranger battles, those flaws would only grow sharper. If there was one constant in Alexander's life, it was restlessness. He could conquer cities, topple kings, and march across deserts, but he could never sit still. To Alexander, every victory was just another stepping stone, every horizon only an invitation to look beyond. Ancient sources describe him as almost incapable of rest. While his soldiers collapsed after 20-mile marches, Alexander was often awake, pacing his tent, summoning officers for midnight councils, or flipping through his copy of Homer's Iliad. He slept little, and when he did, he often woke suddenly, demanding updates from scouts or sketching plans for the next move. Plutarch calls it sleepless ambition, not metaphorically, but literally. This drive was intoxicating for his followers, and exhausting. Imagine being in an army that has just marched across Asia Minor, expecting at least a pause. Instead, Alexander bursts into the tent at dawn. "Pack up, men. We're heading farther east." His officers sighed, his soldiers grumbled, but his will was like gravity, impossible to resist. One story captures this perfectly. After defeating Darius and essentially securing the Persian Empire, Alexander could have returned home as the greatest conqueror Greece had ever seen. Most generals would have stopped there, basking in glory. But Alexander wasn't most generals. Instead, he looked east toward India and declared, There are still worlds to conquer. His men groaned, but followed. Because when your king eats the same rough bread as you, sleeps under the same stars, and then rides at the front of every charge, how do you refuse him? And yet, this obsession carried a dark toll. The farther east they marched, the more resistance his soldiers gave. At the Hyphasis River in India, after years of endless campaigning, his army mutinied. Exhausted, homesick, and battered, they simply refused to go farther. For once, Alexander's charisma and ambition weren't enough. He raged, sulked, tried to shame them, but eventually even he had to yield. His men wanted to go home. Still, the fact that it took nearly a decade, thousands of miles, and the edge of the known world for his army to finally say, "Enough," speaks volumes about his drive. Few leaders in history have dragged so many men so far for so long, fueled by nothing but sheer force of will. Even in smaller moments, his restlessness showed. He was curious about everything: plants, animals, cultures, religions. When marching through strange lands, he peppered locals with questions, collected samples, and dispatched notes back to Greece. It was as if conquering wasn't enough. He wanted to understand the world he was seizing. Aristotle's student was still alive inside him, scribbling observations even as his spear dripped with conquest. For Alexander, daily life was never truly daily. There was no routine, no real rest. Every dawn was an opportunity, every night a stage for new plans. Sleep was wasted time. Pauses were signs of weakness. He lived in perpetual motion, as if afraid that stillness itself might kill him. And perhaps, in the end, it did. His body wore down, his mind burned hot, and by his early 30s, he was a man who had conquered more than anyone before him, yet still fidgeted like a restless youth, searching for the next challenge that no longer existed. That was Alexander's greatest strength and his deepest tragedy. He could win the world, but he could never win peace, not even with himself. By the time Alexander turned his gaze fully eastward, he had already achieved what most men would have considered the pinnacle of glory. He had smashed the Persian armies at Issus, carved his way across Asia Minor, and even stood as master of Egypt, hailed as a liberator and crowned pharaoh. For any other king, this was the natural moment to pause, consolidate, and bask in triumph. But Alexander was not built for pausing, only for pushing. Persia, the vast empire that had once terrified Greece, was now his playground. Marching through its heartland, Alexander behaved both as conqueror and opportunistic tourist. At Persepolis, the jewel of Persia, he initially marveled at its palaces, columns, and treasures. But in a drunken blaze, perhaps as revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century earlier, perhaps as a political statement, or perhaps just as an impulsive act of rage, he ordered the city set aflame. Flames licked across centuries of imperial grandeur, turning golden halls into smoldering ruins. His men cheered. His historians shook their heads. Was this justice, or vandalism dressed as glory? Yet Alexander wasn't just destroying, he was also adopting. In Persia, he began wearing their royal robes, embracing Persian court rituals, and even demanding the controversial practice of proskynesis, bowing before the king. To Persians, it was normal respect. To Greeks, it reeked of blasphemy. The army muttered, "Have we followed a god or just a king?" It was the first time cultural fusion turned into cultural friction. From Persia, he veered south into Egypt, where his reception couldn't have been more different. Egyptians despised Persian rule, so they welcomed Alexander as a liberator. In Memphis, he was crowned as pharaoh. At the oracle of Siwa Oasis, priests declared him the son of Zeus Ammon, effectively branding him divine. For Alexander, this was perfect. To his Macedonian soldiers, he was still their restless king. To Egyptians, he was a living god. Two identities, one man, and neither fully satisfied him. But Egypt wasn't his final destination. His eyes were fixed farther east, where the map blurred into rumor and myth. The Persian king Darius III had fled, and Alexander was determined to hunt him down. His army trudged through deserts, crossed rivers, and stormed mountain fortresses. Darius eventually met his end not at Alexander's hands, but murdered by his own men. When news reached Alexander, he wept, not for pity, but for lost glory. He wanted to defeat Darius himself, face to face, like Achilles against Hector. Instead, his rival died in a ditch, robbed of drama. With Persia broken, Alexander might have stopped. He had wealth, empire, and the title King of Kings. But for Alexander, Persia was just the beginning. Beyond lay India, a land whispered about in Greek imagination, full of strange beasts, exotic riches, and warriors who rode elephants. His men dreaded it. Alexander dreamed of it. For him, it wasn't enough to conquer what was known. He wanted to pierce into the unknown, to carve his name where no Greek had ever set foot. So the army marched east again, farther and farther from home, into lands where the terrain grew harsher, the people stranger, and the cost higher. Each step carried them deeper into Alexander's obsession, and farther into the breaking point of his men. This was no longer just conquest. It was a test of endurance, ambition, and the fragile thread holding king and army together. Conquering Persia wasn't the end. It was just the halfway point in Alexander's restless journey. With Darius gone, and Persepolis in ashes, the army could have turned home to glory and comfort. Instead, Alexander drove them deeper east, into landscapes so harsh they tested the limits of human survival. The first challenge was the Zagros Mountains, a jagged spine of stone that cut across modern-day Iran. Marching through them was less a campaign and more a survival course. Narrow passes forced the phalanx into single-file lines, sarissas awkwardly carried like giant fishing poles. Avalanches, rock slides, and ambushes from mountain tribes turned every mile into a gamble. Soldiers cursed under their breath, wondering if they were fighting Persians or simply the earth itself. Then came the deserts of Central Asia, vast, burning expanses where water was scarcer than loyalty in Alexander's camp. Ancient writers describe men collapsing under the sun, tongues swollen, armor burning against their skin. One famous story tells of scouts bringing Alexander a helmet full of water. His men gathered, watching to see if he would drink. Instead, Alexander poured the water into the sand, declaring, "If my soldiers cannot drink, neither will I." Whether it was genuine solidarity or a masterful PR stunt, the gesture electrified the army. Thirst remained, but so did loyalty. But not every moment was so heroic. In the Gedrosian Desert, modern-day Makran between Iran and Pakistan, Alexander's decision to march his army through one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth nearly destroyed them. Blistering heat, shifting dunes, and salt flats that reflected the sun like a mirror reduced the army to shadows of themselves. Supplies ran out, men scavenged roots, slaughtered pack animals, even drank stagnant brine unfit for beasts. Thousands died, their bones swallowed by sand. To this day, historians debate why Alexander chose this route. Was it poor planning, or a deliberate test of endurance to prove he could outdo any conqueror before him? Either way, it was conquest by suffering as much as by strategy. And yet, Alexander didn't merely endure these lands. He bent them into his legend. Every hardship became another tale of his greatness. When soldiers staggered, he marched at the front. When the road vanished into barren wasteland, he insisted destiny lay beyond. His ability to spin agony into glory was perhaps his greatest weapon. The desert was not just geography, it was a stage, and Alexander made sure the story written there would echo for centuries. The mountains and deserts took their toll, though. Veterans grumbled, officers argued, some muttered openly about turning back. But the magnetism of Alexander, part genius, part madness, kept the army stumbling forward. For every man who cursed him, 10 more still believed they were walking in the company of a living god. By the time the Macedonians emerged from these trials, they were no longer just soldiers. They were survivors of landscapes that should have killed them. And Alexander knew it. He didn't just conquer kingdoms, he conquered nature itself, or at least convinced his men they had. What awaited beyond the deserts and mountains was India, stranger, richer, and more dangerous than anything they had yet faced. Elephants, monsoons, and armies unlike any they had fought before. And Alexander, sleepless as ever, could hardly wait. By the time Alexander's weary army reached the banks of the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE, modern Jhelum River, Pakistan, they were battered but still loyal, or at least too stubborn to quit. Waiting for them on the other side was a new kind of enemy. King Porus, a towering ruler of the Punjab, and his terrifying weapon, war elephants. Now, Macedonians had fought Persians, Scythians, and countless tribes, but elephants were something else entirely. Imagine being a soldier in the phalanx, used to facing horses and chariots, and suddenly staring at a wall of elephants, each armored and tusked, carrying howdahs, wooden platforms, filled with archers. To the Greeks, it was like marching into battle against living siege towers. Horses panicked at the smell alone. Men whispered that even the gods might hesitate. Porus had around 200 elephants, alongside cavalry and infantry, arrayed across the far bank. The Hydaspes itself was swollen with monsoon rains, a barrier Alexander had to cross before he could even fight. A direct assault would have been suicide. So Alexander did what he did best. He outsmarted the impossible. At night, under cover of storm and darkness, he led a picked force upstream, crossing in boats and rafts. By dawn, Porus suddenly realized part of the Macedonian army was already on his side of the river. The trap was sprung. The battle itself was chaos. Elephants charged, tusks goring men, trunks flinging soldiers like rag dolls. The Macedonian phalanx staggered, their sarissas barely holding back the living tanks. Horses screamed, refusing to charge near the beasts. Yet Alexander adapted. He ordered his cavalry to circle and harass Porus's flanks, while the phalanx pinned the elephants in place. Archers and javelin throwers targeted the mahouts, elephant drivers, turning the beasts wild. Without guidance, some elephants panicked, trampling friend and foe alike. The fighting raged for hours in mud and rain. Macedonian casualties were heavy, far worse than many of Alexander's earlier battles. But slowly, discipline and tactics wore Porus's army down. When Porus himself was wounded and captured, Alexander showed a rare moment of mercy. Asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied simply, "Like a king." Alexander, impressed by his dignity, not only spared him but restored him as ruler, now a loyal client king under Macedonian rule. To the Macedonians, the victory was proof of Alexander's genius. Even elephants could not stop him. But for the soldiers, it was also a warning. If India's kings could field such beasts, what awaited deeper in the subcontinent? Monsoons drenched their tents, strange animals roamed the forests, and the further they marched, the stranger the world became. For men who had left Greece nearly a decade earlier, the thrill of glory was wearing thin. Still, Alexander exulted. The Hydaspes was not just a battlefield, it was another page in his legend. He had faced monsters and emerged victorious. His name was now known at the edge of the known world. And yet, even standing knee-deep in Indian mud, Alexander's mind looked farther still, to lands beyond the Ganges, to oceans no Greek had ever seen. But for his soldiers, something had begun to crack. Victory was no longer enough. They were tired, broken, and far from home. And soon, on the banks of another river, they would finally tell Alexander, no. Fresh from the bloody victory at the Hydaspes, Alexander's eyes gleamed with the same old fire. He had beaten elephants, storms, and kings. So why stop? Beyond the horizon lay the mighty Ganges River and kingdoms even larger than Persia. To Alexander, this was destiny, to march until there was no more land left to conquer. But his soldiers had a different perspective. They had been on campaign for nearly 8 years. They had marched thousands of miles, from Greece through Asia Minor, Persia, deserts, and now the strange monsoons of India. Their boots were rotting, their bodies scarred, their spirits drained. Victory no longer felt like glory. It felt like survival. When Alexander announced his plan to push east toward the Ganges, the army fell into uneasy silence. The Ganges basin was rumored to be guarded by armies with thousands of elephants, more than they had faced at the Hydaspes. The men weren't inspired. They were terrified. At the Hyphasis River, modern Beas River, the army finally drew the line. Officers and veterans, usually so loyal, stepped forward and refused to march farther. Ancient sources say one spokesman, the General Coenus, dared to tell Alexander what everyone else was thinking. The men will not go on. They long for their homes, their parents, their children. Great king, you may be endless, but your soldiers are not. It was the unthinkable. Mutiny. Not rebellion against Alexander as king, but rebellion against his endless ambition. Alexander's reaction was predictable. Rage. He stormed, he argued, he tried to shame them, reminding them of their glory, their loyalty, their oaths. But this time, charisma wasn't enough. The men stood firm. After years of marching, they had found their breaking point. For days, Alexander sulked in his tent, refusing to eat or speak, hoping his silent fury would bend the army to his will. But the soldiers didn't budge. And finally, for one of the only times in his life, Alexander yielded. With bitterness in his voice, he announced they would turn back. But not before staging one last act of grandeur. At the Hyphasis, Alexander ordered the building of 12 massive altars, each as tall as a tower, dedicated to the gods. They marked the furthest eastern reach of his empire, a monument to say, this is where Alexander chose to stop, not where he was forced. A face-saving gesture carved in stone. The mutiny at the Hyphasis was more than just a pause. It was a turning point. For the first time, the unstoppable conqueror met a force stronger than Persia, elephants or deserts, the exhaustion of his own men. And though he dressed it up as a voluntary decision, Alexander knew he had been defeated, not by kings, but by fatigue. The road now bent westward. His dream of conquering India, perhaps even reaching the ocean at the edge of the world, was shattered. Instead, Alexander would lead his battered army home, a journey that would prove just as deadly as his conquests. Turning back from the Hyphasis did not mean peace. For Alexander, retreat was not a simple matter of marching home. He refused to look weak. If he could not conquer more kingdoms, he would at least conquer nature itself. And so he chose the harshest route imaginable, a march through the Gedrosian Desert, modern-day Makran, stretching along southern Iran and Pakistan. Why? Historians still argue. Some say he wanted to prove he could succeed where legendary Persian kings like Cyrus had failed. Others think it was pure pride, a final stunt to cement his reputation. Whatever the reason, it was a decision that cost thousands of lives. The Gedrosian Desert was merciless. Sand dunes stretched endlessly, the sun scorched like fire, and water was almost non-existent. Supplies ran out within days. Soldiers scavenged whatever they could find, roots, scraps, even killing their pack animals for food. Worse, there was no shade. Armor turned into ovens, cloaks into rags. Men collapsed on the march, their tongues swollen, their skin blistered raw. Ancient accounts describe scenes bordering on nightmare. Horses dropped dead in the sand, their carcasses left to rot. Women and camp followers staggered behind, carrying children who would not survive the night. When rare streams appeared, men fought like animals to reach them, sometimes drowning in their desperation. And Alexander? True to form, he marched at the front, sharing the same thirst and hunger as his men. One famous story tells of soldiers finding a small helmet of water and bringing it to him. Surrounded by parched troops, Alexander lifted the helmet, then poured the water onto the ground. "If all cannot drink, neither will I." Was it genuine solidarity or theater? Maybe both. But it was enough to keep his men moving. Still, no gesture could erase the toll. Estimates suggest tens of thousands perished in the Gedrosian desert. The survivors emerged like ghosts, emaciated, broken, and traumatized. For many soldiers, it was worse than any battle. At least in battle, glory was the reward. In Gedrosia, there was only sand, suffering, and silence. When they finally stumbled out of the desert, Alexander framed it as a triumph. He claimed to have succeeded where others had failed, turning disaster into legend. But his army knew the truth. They had been sacrificed to their king's pride. The Gedrosian march became a wound in their memory, a reminder that following Alexander meant not just glory, but endless endurance of his ambition, even to the edge of death. Yet for all their suffering, they still followed him. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps loyalty, or perhaps the unshakable magnetism of a man who could lead them through hell and still make them believe they were walking in the footsteps of gods. The march back did not end in Gedrosia. Ahead lay Babylon, and with it, the final chapter of Alexander's restless life. When Alexander and what remained of his army finally emerged from the nightmare of the Gedrosian desert, they looked less like conquerors and more like survivors of an apocalypse. Hollow-eyed, scarred, their numbers thinned by thirst and sand, they limped westward into Mesopotamia. And yet, when they reached Babylon in 323 BCE, the city greeted them as if they had returned triumphant from Olympus itself. Babylon was no ordinary capital. It was the beating heart of the ancient Near East, a city of vast temples, hanging gardens, if they still stood, and towering ziggurats scraping the sky. For Alexander, it was the perfect stage on which to crown his legacy. Here, in this crossroads of civilizations, he envisioned making Babylon the capital of his world empire. Forget dusty Macedon or provincial Pella. Alexander dreamed of ruling from the center of the known world. The city welcomed him with gifts, tributes, and ceremonies. Priests and officials lined the streets, eager to bend to the will of the new King of Kings. His army, battered but still breathing, was showered with rewards, feasts, and promises of rest. For a moment, it seemed as though the nightmare of India and Gedrosia had been washed away in the river of Babylonian wealth. But beneath the gold and celebration lay shadows. Alexander's ambitions had not cooled. Instead of resting, he immediately began planning new campaigns. Arabia was next on his list, and beyond that, who knows? Rome, Carthage, perhaps the edges of the world where the ocean swallowed the land. His mind was still on fire, and he demanded his men prepare for yet another impossible march. The soldiers obeyed, but uneasily. Many had followed him for more than a decade, across 3 continents, through deserts, mountains, and endless battles. They had buried friends in foreign sands, left families behind in Macedonia, and now returned to Babylon expecting rest. Instead, their king was already sketching routes into Arabia on clay tablets. Whispers spread through the camp. When will it end? Will it ever end? Adding to the tension were the political undercurrents. Alexander had adopted Persian customs and titles, angering some of his Macedonian veterans. He had married Persian noblewomen and encouraged his officers to do the same, but many saw this as betrayal of Greek values. His vision of a fusion empire looked noble on scrolls but messy in reality. In the taverns of Babylon, Macedonian veterans muttered that their king had become more Persian than Greek. And then there was Alexander's health. Years of sleepless ambition, endless marching, wounds from battle, and heavy drinking had begun to erode his body. Sources describe him as restless, prone to fevers, and drinking far more than was wise. In banquets, he still played the charismatic leader, but behind closed doors, he sometimes collapsed, coughing or burning with fever. His body was finally rebelling against his will. So there he stood in Babylon, the master of the known world, yet restless as ever, planning new conquests while his men longed for peace. To the city's priests, he was a living god. To his soldiers, he was both hero and tyrant. To himself, he was Achilles reborn, destined never to stop until he had carved his name into every corner of the earth. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Babylon, in the spring of 323 BCE, should have been a place of celebration. Alexander had returned at the height of his power, undefeated in battle, ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and still only 32 years old. But instead of resting, he plunged into a whirl of banquets, rituals, and relentless planning for his next campaign. The banquets were legendary and deadly. Ancient writers describe marathon drinking sessions that stretched late into the night. At one, he reportedly downed a massive bowl of unmixed wine in a single gulp, a feat of bravado meant to impress his men. The Greeks normally diluted their wine with water, but Alexander increasingly ignored that rule, drinking like a man who had no time left to waste. Within hours, he collapsed with stabbing pains in his stomach. Some say he cried out as if struck by an invisible spear. What followed was a slow, agonizing decline. Fever gripped him. His body, worn down by years of wounds, exhaustion, and excess, finally began to betray him. For days he drifted between lucidity and delirium. He tried to rise, to command, to keep planning the invasion of Arabia, but his strength failed. His voice grew weak. His generals, desperate, gathered around his bed. Soldiers crowded outside his tent, demanding to see their king, fearing, or perhaps knowing, the end was near. Accounts vary. Poison, malaria, typhoid, liver failure from alcohol. Ancient historians loved the drama of mystery. Some whispered he had been poisoned by rivals who feared his growing godlike pretensions. Others insisted it was simply nature claiming what no spear could. Whatever the truth, the spectacle of Alexander's slow fading felt almost theatrical. The world's greatest conqueror, struck down not by enemy blades, but by fever and frailty. And still, even in his final moments, Alexander clung to his legend. When his men filed past his bed to glimpse him one last time, he reportedly raised his hand in silence, acknowledging each soldier. It was a final gesture of solidarity, as if to say, "I see you. We did this together." Whether it happened exactly so or not, the story carried through the centuries, because it was the kind of ending Alexander himself would have wanted. His generals pressed him with the ultimate question: "To whom do you leave your empire?" Weak and barely able to speak, he is said to have whispered, "To the strongest." 3 words that were both prophecy and curse. Within months of his death, his empire fractured as his generals tore it apart in bloody wars of succession. The dream of one world under Alexander died with him. But in that Babylonian palace, at that final banquet turned deathbed, none of that was yet known. All that mattered was the sight of Alexander, pale and fevered, a man who had conquered everything except the one enemy he could never defeat: time. On June 10th, or perhaps June 11th, 323 BCE, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar at Babylon, the impossible happened. Alexander the Great died. He was just 32 years old. A man who had crossed 3 continents, toppled the greatest empire of his age, and never lost a battle, now lay still on a bed soaked with fever and sweat. His soldiers, hardened veterans of a decade of war, wept openly when the news spread. Some refused to believe it. Others insisted he was only sleeping, too mighty to be undone by illness. Ancient rumor even claimed his body showed no signs of decay for days after death, proof, to some, that he was divine. The reactions in Babylon were a mixture of grief, awe, and terror. For the army, their anchor was gone. For the generals, the question of succession became an open wound. Alexander left no clear adult heir. His only son, Alexander IV, was not yet born. Roxana, his Bactrian wife, was pregnant at the time. Another potential heir, his half-brother Aristeus, was mentally unfit to rule. The empire stretched from Greece to India, but there was no one strong enough to hold it together. At first, the soldiers demanded a say. In Macedonian tradition, the army proclaimed kings. But instead of one clear successor, the assembly descended into shouting and threats. Some supported Aristeus as a puppet king. Others wanted to wait for Roxana's unborn child. Still others believed only one of the powerful generals could truly rule. The tension boiled over. Blades were drawn, officers clashed, and Babylon teetered on the edge of civil war within days of Alexander's last breath. Meanwhile, the king's body became an object of both reverence and political struggle. It was placed in a golden sarcophagus, surrounded by incense and guarded by soldiers. But even in death, Alexander was not allowed peace. His generals debated where he should be buried: Macedonia, the land of his fathers, or Babylon, the capital he had chosen. In the end, Ptolemy would hijack the funeral procession and bring the body to Egypt, entombing him in Alexandria. Even in death, Alexander was a prize to be fought over. For the common soldiers, grief soon turned to unease. They had followed their king across deserts and rivers, believing he was invincible. Now, without him, the vast empire seemed fragile. Who would command them? Who could inspire them to march one step farther? The answer, as history showed, was no one. The dream of unity began unraveling before the body was even cold. And yet, in the stunned silence of Babylon, one fact was undeniable. A man barely into his 30s had reshaped the world so completely that even his death felt larger than life. For his men, it was like waking from a dream into a nightmare of uncertainty. For his generals, it was the start of a vicious scramble for power. For history, it was the moment when Alexander ceased to be just a king and began his transformation into legend. If Alexander's life was a symphony of conquest, his death was a drumroll of chaos. The empire he built in 11 relentless years, stretching from Greece to India, began to fracture almost the moment he breathed his last. Why? Because Alexander had left the world's largest empire with no clear heir. At first, the generals tried to improvise. They proclaimed 2 kings: Aristeus, Alexander's half-brother, who was mentally unfit but convenient as a figurehead, and the unborn child of Roxana, Alexander's Bactrian wife. When the child was later born, He was named Alexander IV. On paper, the empire now had a royal partnership. In reality, the true power belonged to the generals, the so-called diadochi, or successors. And if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that ambitious generals don't share well. At first, they tried dividing the empire into satrapies, provinces. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus claimed Babylon, Antigonus took Asia Minor, Lysimachus got Thrace, and Cassander controlled Macedonia. It was supposed to be temporary, a caretaker arrangement until Alexander's son came of age. But within months, the arrangement crumbled. Each general saw himself not as a caretaker, but as the rightful heir. The wars that followed, the wars of the successors, turned Alexander's dream of unity into a nightmare of betrayal and bloodshed. Armies of former comrades clashed across the empire, each flying the banner of Alexander's memory while carving up his legacy for themselves. Babylon, Greece, Egypt, and Asia Minor all became battlefields in a struggle that lasted decades. The violence was ruthless. Roxana and the young Alexander Thorfor were pawns in the power games, eventually murdered to clear the path for ambitious generals. Aridaeus, too, was eliminated. Alexander's family tree was pruned with cold precision until no true heir remained. His bloodline, once destined to rule the world, was extinguished within a generation. Meanwhile, the generals elevated themselves into kings. Ptolemy declared himself Pharaoh of Egypt, founding the dynasty that would culminate centuries later with Cleopatra. Seleucus carved out a massive kingdom stretching from Syria to Persia. Antigonus and his descendants ruled parts of Greece and Asia Minor. Instead of one empire, Alexander's dream shattered into several, each bearing the fingerprints of his lieutenants. Ironically, the very men who had once marched shoulder to shoulder under Alexander now fought over his corpse, both literally and symbolically. His body itself was stolen. Ptolemy intercepted the funeral procession and brought the great king to Egypt, entombing him in Alexandria. Whoever possessed Alexander's remains could claim his aura of legitimacy. Even in death, he was a weapon. For the soldiers who had followed him across continents, the aftermath was disillusioning. They had bled for one man, only to see his legacy torn apart by many. Some settled as mercenaries in the new kingdoms. Others simply melted away into foreign lands, never returning home. The army that had once shaken the world dissolved into history. Thus, the empire that seemed eternal at Alexander's death crumbled within years. But in that collapse, something curious happened. Greek culture spread wider than ever. Cities named Alexandria dotted the map. Greek became the language of trade and scholarship, and the Hellenistic age was born, a strange hybrid of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian cultures. Alexander's dream of fusion had failed politically, but culturally it endured. So while his empire died with him, his influence lived on, not in a single crown, but in the countless kingdoms, cities, and ideas seeded by his whirlwind of conquest. Alexander died young, his empire torn apart almost as soon as it was built. By any practical measure, his dream of one united world was a failure. And yet more than 2,000 years later, his name still echoes, not as a mere king, but as a legend. Why? Because his true empire was never just land. It was memory. Culturally, his conquests lit the fuse of what we now call the Hellenistic age. Greek language, art, science, and philosophy spread from the Mediterranean to the edge of India, mingling with Persian, Egyptian, and local traditions. Cities founded by Alexander, at least 20 named Alexandria, became centers of trade and knowledge. The most famous, Alexandria in Egypt, would one day house the legendary Library of Alexandria, symbol of human curiosity. Though his empire fractured, the cultural world he sparked endured for centuries. Militarily, Alexander became the gold standard of conquest. Every general after him measured himself against his shadow. Julius Caesar openly wept at 32, lamenting that he had achieved so little compared to Alexander at the same age. Napoleon carried books about him on campaign. Even modern military academies still study his tactics: the hammer and anvil, the wedge formation, the genius of using speed and surprise. But beyond tactics and culture, Alexander's greatest legacy was psychological. He proved that the world was larger than people imagined, and that it could be reached. To Greeks who once saw the horizon as the end, Alexander showed there were more lands, more peoples, more stories beyond. He broke the boundaries of imagination as much as geography. And yet, his legacy is also tragic. His restless ambition drove his men to the edge of the known world, but left nothing stable behind. His heirs butchered each other, his bloodline vanished, and the empire he sacrificed so much to create lasted barely longer than a heartbeat. Greatness, it seems, came at the cost of permanence. So how should we remember him? As a hero or a tyrant? A visionary or a megalomaniac? The answer is all of them. Alexander was both the boy who carried Homer's Iliad under his pillow and the man who burned Persepolis to the ground. He was the king who marched beside his soldiers, sharing their hunger, and the despot who killed his closest friend in a drunken rage. He was brilliant and reckless, compassionate and cruel, godlike and painfully human. Perhaps that is why he endures. Myths prefer simplicity, but history remembers complexity. Alexander wasn't just the Great because of the lands he conquered. He was the Great because he embodied the contradictions of ambition itself, the drive to rise higher, go farther, and leave a mark that outlives the flesh. In the end, he got what he wanted. He died young, but his name never did. 2 millennia later, we still whisper it with awe. Alexander, a man who could not conquer time, but conquered memory. And perhaps that was the greater victory all along.